Thank you, everyone, for filling this room in this beautiful, beautiful building here in New York City in Greenwich Village. This is September 10th, 2018. You are here at the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry event called From 9/11 Truth to 9/11 Justice. I'm Barbara Honegger. I'm your MC tonight. Now I'm going to introduce the president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. This is attorney David Meiswinkle. He holds a BA from Rutgers College, a master's in arts from New York University, and a JD from Seton Hall University Law School. Please welcome David Meiswinkle.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for being here. It's really a great crowd. You know, I used to go to school not far from here, NYU. I went to graduate school, and I used to stay up all night studying, and I'd come out in the morning, and I'd look to my left, and I said hello to the Twin Towers, and look to my right, said hello to the Empire State Building, and I'd walk up Fifth Avenue and have something to eat. Now, sometimes at the night when I was doing the studying, I'd come out in this area and I'd walk right by this building. And I'd always say, wow, what a neat building. Didn't know anything about it. And little did I know that I would be here someday addressing an audience on such an important issue. Now, today I walked down 6th Avenue and I looked down below where the Liberty Tower is, no longer the World Trade Center towers. And the Liberty Tower was shrouded in clouds. You couldn't see it. And I'm thinking, how symbolic is that as far as our country being sort of shrouded in clouds, our liberty being shrouded in clouds. And before we started, before this meeting started, I walked around the building just to see what was I going to start off with in talking to you guys. And what came to me was an old thing we used to say when I was at Rutgers and we did activist things, and what it was something like, what do you want? Truth. When do you want it? Now. What do you want? Truth. When do you want it? Now. What do you want? Truth. When do you want it? Now. So that's where enter now the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, because that's what we're out about, to get to the truth of the most egregious offense in the history of our country. Now, on our board are some very prestigious people. One that couldn't be here is our litigation director, Mick Harrison, who is very influential and involved in all the litigation we do, in particular the grand jury petition, which I'll go over just briefly with you. He is ill, he's not feeling good, so he told me to extend his greetings to you all, wishes he was here, he's in spirit, and that's Mick. Now, the other our other people are Michael Springman, he's down in Washington, he's an attorney. Julio Gomez in New Jersey, he's an attorney. Bill Jacoby's here, he's an attorney. You know Ed Asner, the famous actor, and he is a supporter, and not only a supporter, he's a board member. And we have David Cole, who's an amazing researcher. Barbara, you know, she's an amazing dynamo, amazing woman, and she's a board member, incredible researcher and writer. And we have, I mentioned David Cole as a researcher. And let me see if I missed somebody. I might unintentionally. I think I got everybody. We have 8 board members right now, all right? So as I said, what we're about is trying to uncover what happened back 17 years ago, if you can believe that, right? So we keep it alive, we keep the torch alive. And we are also involved in a number of other things besides what I'm going to talk about. Well, it's the grand jury petition. Now that was filed right downtown here in Lower Manhattan on April the 10th of this year. And now it's been amended and it's been amended to include this. I'll just tell you what the amendments are, because we wanted to make it more solid. So in July 31st of this summer, we amended it. Not that it's not solid, it is. But you can imagine the attack we're going to have by the opposition, so we want to make it even stronger. And that, besides the federal law criminalizes bombing of places in public use in government facilities, we added also acts of terrorism, transcending national boundaries, providing material support for terrorists, and the killing of federal employment, government employments. I believe there was at least 2 FBI people that were killed during that period of time. Of course, aiding and abetting is there in conspiracy. In other words, people didn't do this by themselves. They had friends, they had used monies, they bought things, they planned with other people, etc. So that's all included in the complaint. Now, in order to, not the complaint yet, the petition. Grand jury petition has a number, or the grand jury, the organization that's sponsoring the grand jury, we have a number of committees. And you can, if you want to, you can get on a committee. And these committees are to, like, Follow the Money Committee, the Obstruction of Government Committee, the FOIDAs, the Freedom of Information Committees, the Shanksville Committee, and the Pentagon Committee. These are active committees now. We're doing investigations. If you have a background in that area and you would like to get involved in that area, see me or see Barbara. Give us your name and the telephone number, and we'll call you up and we'll talk, all right? We are a young group. We could go south and disappear because we're volunteer for the most part. We're volunteer. And we need the support from people. And Richard's going to talk to you about the evidence, and I have to give so much credit to architects and engineers over the years, because they really kept this alive, probably for most of us in here, all right? They gave us something to stand on and realize that there's another side of the story other than the official story. But just to go down a list of things that just jump out at me when I talk about the investigations they did. They failed to secure the scene. They failed to prevent spoliation of evidence. They failed to test for accelerants. And when I say they, I mean the government. They failed to test for explosives and or incendiaries. They failed to analyze the dust. They failed to explain the tremendous heat and the sulfidization of steel. They failed to account for free fall. They failed to explain molten metal. They failed to include in one of the reports in the Building 7 the stiffener plates, the shear studs, the lateral beams, and the proper seating capacity. They actually lied and fudged the report, and thank for Tony Zimbardi and other people involved in our architects and engineers. They discovered that flaw in their report. They failed to call witnesses, if you can believe. The firemen they didn't call. Willie Rodriguez they didn't call. They didn't look at Barry Jennings' testimony, if you can believe that. Think of that, 118 firemen, and that's all part of the evidence. All their statements that they heard, saw explosions or involved with explosions. And they failed to explain advance warnings. They failed to explain how a high-rise steel structured building could collapse, and never has in the history of high-rise steel structured buildings, all right? So I'm personally got involved with the 2 lawsuits that most people don't know, not lawsuits, but actions. Besides the FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act, that's on a federal level. The states have their own law. In New Jersey, it's called the OPRA, or the Open Public Records Act. And in Pennsylvania, it's called the Right to Know Act. Just to let you know that we filed, I'm representing the Lawyers Committee on an action in Trenton, because on September 11th, not too far from across the river, 3 gentlemen were seen filming the towers of 9/11 and celebrating, and that was reported. And the East Rutherford police, along with the state police, arrested those people, and they became known eventually, because they were arrested later that day with 2 other people, as is quoted, dancing Israelis or high-fivers. And they were taken into custody for 2 months. And then Chertoff, who was the second in charge in the Justice Department, released them with minor charges about visa violations, all right? But my understanding, there was a lot of problems with their polygraphs and the inconsistent stories, and nevertheless, they went back, and there's argument that even from their own lips that they were here to document it, which shows some foreknowledge. Anyway, I filed the action on behalf of the Lawyers Committee. I've talked to the federal judge with the Attorney General down there twice on conference calls and argued in the court for our researcher, David Cole, tipped me off that he had a report to show that New Jersey State Police was involved in developing the photos. There's, I believe, 76 photos, 8 by 10, that show whatever they saw, whatever they were filming. So we want to get a hold of it. So we've got 2 rounds with them where they providing some affidavits, were, to my opinion, bogus affidavits, not bogus, but they weren't done authentically or in good faith. So the judge sort of agreed with us each time. So now that we're waiting, they said they couldn't find the photographs and the reports about explosive residue on the fabric and the blanket that they were tested for. So now we're going to get a, I'm waiting right now. We extended their time for 2 weeks. They brought the 3rd different attorney and attorney general, assistant attorney general. They've asked for 2 more weeks to provide a logbook, which should have been produced originally, which now we have a logbook. We don't know what it says. We know there'll probably be redactions in it to explain maybe what happened to the photographs, because if there's a policy they should keep the photographs, we believe they should have them and release them. And also, maybe even more important, the person, the name of the person, which should have been produced right away. We've said we want, now that we have a name, we want that person, affidavit from that person as to what happened. So that's a little of what we're doing in New Jersey. In Pennsylvania, I've done a few actions, the requests there, which have now allowed me, and I went with last time, invited Mick Harrison and another fellow. We went out there twice, another attorney, and this is Shanksville. We've been into Shanksville, probably the only people that have been there. I've been into Wallace Miller. He's the coroner in Shanksville. We've seen the files of over 1,080 body parts, and I'll tell you, it's devastating. There's nothing there, at least of the 1,080 that I've seen, that looks like, you know, what you would identify as a human being, although it's human. Unfortunately, the only thing I can remember was a part of a palm and a part of like the ball of a foot. Everything is you know, annihilated. It seems like, okay? So what we've asked for is the diagrams and maps of where they found these parts to see what the spread is and things of that nature. But we have, waiting for them now, we must have labeled hundreds of documents. It's going to cost a lot of money to get this stuff. But we want to get it because this will lead to other things. And what the strategy here is to go local, go to the state, because at the federal level, you know, we might figure that it's already fairly corrupt. And maybe there's more integrity at the lower level, we're hoping. So we have actions, and Mick is doing one in Washington, D.C. with our researcher David Cole on the NIST, okay, National Institute for Standards and Technology, did a report on the towers in Building 7, and that's to get some documents which they keep on not giving, includes a video, which is very important. And Mick tells me that they're coming now where they're going to get a decision from the judge. He's either going to agree with us, or he's going to order a trial, or, you know, he's going to say produce the document or the video, or, you know, we're going to get a summary judgment in our favor. All right, so that's what we're doing. So we're actually taking the evidence, or we're trying to get more evidence and going to court to do that. So it's kind of exciting because it's not been done to my knowledge. So in some ways, in this meeting here, what the architects and engineers have done is really historical. What the Lawyers Committee is doing presently is very historical too. Sometimes you don't see it because your hand is against your face. In perspective, some years from now, we might have something to show for it. Again, at least we tried. It's a venture, you know, we have to try it. So this is a response. We have the mandamus. The mandamus is where it's we're about to file it, and we pulled off for a number of reasons. One, it could be better, but that wasn't the total reason. Two is we had contact with the U.S. Attorney. And this is a letter that Nick wrote to her, and I'll tell you her response, and I'll end at that. This says Ms. Somberg, and she is the head of the Chief Criminal Division at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ms. Somberger, I'm writing to follow up on the call my colleague, Attorney David Meiswinkle, and I made to your office yesterday. Mr. Meiswinkle is the chair of the board for Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and I am executive director for that nonprofit organization. The other parties copied by this email are attorney members of our board of directors. We left a voicemail for you yesterday requesting a few moments of your time. 5 minutes likely would suffice by telephone, so that we might check the status of our petition filed April 10, 2018, and our amended petition filed July 30, 2018, with your office. I believe 5 minutes for this call would be time well spent. Our board of directors meets this evening, and we have important decisions to make this evening regarding how we proceed in regard to these petitions we submitted to the United States Attorney for the Southern District Court of New York. I will be available all day today and hope you can give me a quick call or email stating the status of the U.S. Attorney's action on our petitions. This was Mick Harrison, and this was a response. Mr. Harrison, thank you for your outreach. I hope to be able to respond to you in the near future, but not in time for your board meeting this evening. I did, however, want to acknowledge receipt of your email. Now, you can take it either way, but she did respond, and she says, I hope to respond, be able to respond, which means telling me that I think she'd like to. I don't know if her bosses are going to allow her to, but at least we have a step in the right direction. If we can negotiate something with them and they tell us, hey, we're going to do it, we're going to do a grand jury petition, that's what we want. If not, then we go into court, the mandamus. The federal law says what we did, the statute we used says that they have an obligation, it's not arbitrary, it's a mandatory, to present the evidence we're giving them. It's in our newsletter, our website. So if you go on lc4911.org, you can see all the exhibits yourself. And they have an obligation to present that to a special grand jury. And that's what we have to argue it. And if they beat us on this level, then we'll have to go to the appellate level, and it might even go to the Supreme Court, if you can believe it, just to qualify what the responsibilities are to the people for the United States Attorney to do a proper investigation, the most egregious crime that ever was committed in this country. Thank you for being here. All right.
Attorney Bill Jacoby is a board member and treasurer of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry and is the national chair, as I said, of the 9/11 Truth Action Project, also known as 9/11 TAP. He was admitted to the bar of New York, is now retired from that. He worked predominantly in management positions in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors, which I think that covers the whole world, doesn't it, Bill? He was executive director of a community development corporation in East Harlem here in New York, president of 2 renewable energy startups, chief counsel for a municipal community development agency, and director of a rural development project in both Peru and Bolivia. He currently applies his efforts to coordinating national grassroots efforts, and one of those is the 9/11 vigils that are happening around the country, in cities around the country tomorrow, in support of the Lawyers Committee and our petition project. He has his MPA degree from the University of Pittsburgh, a JD degree from Duquesne Law School, and a BA in government from Dartmouth College. So please welcome William Jacoby.
Thank you all. It just goes to show you, if you live long enough, you get a long resume. I hate to, one critiques Barb at one's at great risks, but she was giving me credit for what was going on with the vigils around the country, and that's not totally true. There's a core of very dedicated volunteers who've been putting in enormous amounts of time in developing them, particularly Trina Silver down near Tampa. Many of you have been in touch with, I believe. Matt Van Slyke, a dedicated guy in Chicago who came up with the idea of vigils and has been kind of the driving force for what they stand for. And we have people like Mike Santangelo here in the audience, who's working on several here in New York, and Ross, of course. Well, Ross has been helping, and there's a lot of people here who are helping. I'm sure if I try to name everybody, I'll miss some that are here. I also can't rattle off all the 18 cities, but I'll mention a few. Yeah. There's a gentleman in Perth, Australia, who's organizing one. There's one in British Columbia, Canada. We have one in Arizona, Tempe, Arizona. We have two at least in Oregon. We have one in Dyersburg, Tennessee. One in Pearl, Mississippi. These are in many cases off the beaten track of the truth movement, people who are running up against the current in their communities, speaking out for the first time, showing up maybe in one or two people, sometimes with a banner, but others are larger. Boston, there are 2 or 3 things going on. DC, some of it will be covered by video tomorrow. So this is an effort to build a nucleus for the kind of support that this effort will need. Remember, although I'm a member of the Lawyers Committee, I don't believe that the lawyers can accomplish our goal unaided. First, you've heard that we're still a very small organization ourselves. We're taking on the biggest enemies in the world, and we're one of the smallest NGOs in the world. That's going to have to change, and we're going to need the help of those of you in this room and those who are listening to this video to help bring that change about. But we're also going to need to be able to work at the grassroots level in congressional districts around the country, and that's what the vigils are a first step towards. So we learned, I remember learning in law school many decades ago already that the Supreme Court doesn't change, the Supreme Court is influenced by public opinion, and we're going to have to start working on public opinion as well as the briefs. Our briefs are strong, our public support is latent, but needs to become very visible and very, very, very powerful. So between the efforts of all the organizations that are working on this, the architects and engineers who've been the trailblazers in giving us solid information and solid professionalism in the story, and the work we're doing now to build grassroots organizations through TAP, and our lawyers' work here, we think we're getting the groundwork for a much bigger change. So hopefully next year you'll see continued progress as we go forward with this, and I want to thank you for all being here and helping us along the way. Thank you.
Richard Gage, AIA, is a San Francisco Bay Area architect, now living in Idaho, and a member of the American Institute of Architects, that's the AIA, and is the founding member and head of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Richard became first interested in researching the true causes of the destruction of World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 after hearing a startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, the dean of the 9/11 Truth Movement, David Ray Griffin, on Bonnie Faulkner's Guns and Butter radio program in 2006. So a big shout out to our soul sister Bonnie Faulkner, who was just banned from the flagship Pacifica radio station KPFA. But thank God she is still here on WBAI, and Richard and I were on her program just the other morning announcing this event. So when Richard was driving down the freeway and he heard David Ray Griffin on Bonnie Faulkner's Guns and Butter radio program way back in 2006, as I understand it, he had to pull to the side of the road because he was so shocked to listen to the rest of the program. And that began the quest of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now numbers over 3,000 professional licensed architects and engineers, all demanding, by signing the A&E petition, a new, open, full subpoena power investigation into the true causes of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center high-rise buildings, World Trade Center 7 of which was not hit by any plane and yet collapsed for its first third in pure free fall. So thank you and welcome Richard Gage.
Thank you, Barbara. As Barbara mentioned, we have now 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. They were all hit over the head by a figurative 2x4 upon hearing about this information, which we had not heard from our mainstream media. Some of them are here today. Would those of you who have signed our petition as an architect or engineer stand and just, we'd like to honor you. Well, here's 1 and 2. Awesome. Ross Muir, structural engineer. Bill Bernier, architect. New York, thanks guys. We just honor you. World Trade Center 7, as Barbara said, was not hit by an airplane like I was on that day I heard David Ray Griffin. I really did. I was just in shock. I had to pull over in my car, and I'm going, what am I hearing? Here's this old man, right? He doesn't sound like he has any axe to grind, but he's telling a completely different story than what we heard that day. He was telling us about World Trade Center Building 7, half the height of the Twin Towers, a football field away north of the North Tower here, part of the World Trade Center complex. Wasn't hit by a plane, but 7 hours later, it went down too. At 5:20 in the afternoon, here it is, having survived the other 2 Twin Towers. Let's just take a look at what happened to this building. Let's just jump right into it. East penthouse falls first. 6 seconds later, this happens. You know, most architects and engineers know nothing about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. Not until we tell them at the architecture and engineering conferences. NIST comes along 7 years later and says, hey folks, I know this is the first high-rise that's ever collapsed due to fire, but guess what? It came down due to fire. What? It came down due to fire? What fires? These fires. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in these buildings. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. So I've been tasked to give you a half-hour summary of this evidence, which I'm going to try to do. It's 4 hours of information. And guess what? The fires have never brought down a skyscraper, even much larger, longer lasting and hotter fires in these buildings. Not in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, or Caracas, Venezuela have we ever had a high-rise come down before 9/11 due to fire. We do have something that can bring high-rises down due not to fire, but by setting pre-placed explosives in these buildings. This is called controlled demolition. There's only a handful of companies around the country that can, around the world in fact, that can do this. It's an art, it's a science, it's engineering. It's very difficult to do. You can't do it by setting a few small scattered fires around the building. There's a set of features associated with these controlled demolitions, and I want to show you, because it turns out that Building 7 has all of these features. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen
high shots.
to Dan Rather.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
That's intuitive. Thank you very much, Dan. We appreciate that. A 7-year-old can figure out what's going on with these buildings. It's not that difficult. Am I right, Ross? It doesn't take a structural engineer.
No, it doesn't.
But it took me 5 years. How long did it take you?
It took me 13 years because I thought they were going to look at the dust.
Yeah, they have all kinds of things they tell us. But this one came down, straight down into its own footprint. Take a look from West Street. Feature number 2 of controlled demolition. The main penthouse drops first, a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that mean? That means the supporting structure underneath that main penthouse and screen wall have to be removed all at once, all 24 of those columns, so that that penthouse can fall. That completely violates NIST's theory that the column instability started under the east penthouse, traveled laterally across this football-sized building in 6 seconds, the time from the east penthouse fell to the time the overall building fell. and into its own pile. Yes, the center of the building is in the center of the footprint, but I'm not quite sure yet. Let's compare side by side. Building 7 on the left and known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. Should have been the first, if not the only, serious hypothesis to be considered. But it wasn't seriously considered. How do we do that? How do we bring a building down symmetrically? We have to remove all 80 columns virtually at once on each floor, synchronistically timed. Otherwise, the building begins to tip over. And there are plenty of failed controlled demolitions that do exactly that. These fires are not going to do that. At this point in our presentation to architects and engineers, they get it. Their knees start shaking. They get dry mouth. They start quivering. And they shut up and they listen because we've got them. This building fell at free fall acceleration. How fast is that? That's this fast. 3, 2, 1. Fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. But wait, there was 40,000 tons of structural steel supporting this building before that happened. And suddenly, it's not there anymore? What happens to that? NIST acknowledges that it came down at free fall acceleration after having been publicly embarrassed by members of AE 911 Truth in their technical conference, and they had to admit it in their final report. But they don't admit the implications of that. What are the implications of a free fall acceleration? It's that there was no structure. All of a sudden, section B in this diagram is removed, allowing the building to come down for a third of its 7-second fall in free fall acceleration, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure. Here's a moment-resisting steel frame structure, 40,000 tons, where the columns and the beams are rigidly welded to each other. All of a sudden, they give up, every one of them, because you have 47 stories compressing to about 4 or 5 stories, like a house of cards. This doesn't happen in natural building collapses. In natural building collapses, we have a recognizable building at the base. The structural members are not severed one from the other. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We don't have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. What? Let's go back to the official story. No evidence of explosives. Did you look? No, we didn't look for evidence of explosives. This is a year later in writing. They actually acknowledge that. You can't find what you're not looking for. But we have plenty of witnesses that describe explosions, and we have explosions themselves. Just moments to share with you. Let's jump to the Twin Towers because we've got to go on. Does it have a sudden onset like Building 7? You tell me. It's there, and then immediately it drops. There's no hesitation, there's no jolt, there's no impact, and it just does what it does when the structure is removed so that it can fall suddenly. The South Tower, same thing. Watch. It's there, and then suddenly it begins to fall straight down. We'll talk about how fast that's coming down in a moment. First, let's see, do we have any patterned explosions? Are there witnesses of explosions, flashes of light? Graham McQueen researched. In 2005, we finally learned that we have 500 first responders that were recorded in September and October following 9/11. And we didn't know about this because the city held this information, but finally we learned, and it's on the transcripts, and we have 118 of these firefighters talking about sounds, hearing sounds of explosions, experiencing explosions, seeing flashes of light, many of them, like this one. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it came down. Hey, the ground is shaking, and then the towers come down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking, felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up, and the tower is collapsing. Not the tower collapsing, causing these sounds, causing these vibrations, but vice versa. Listen to these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
It goes on and on and on. There's 100 of these examples, first responders and others. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Well, there's other witnesses, like the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which picks up these signals. Well, how do those signals relate to what's happening in the towers? We have the first plane impact, by the way. There's plane impacts that were picked up, and there's signals associated with around the time of the collapse. But the first plane impact, we have the seismic event occurring here, but guess what? The plane doesn't actually impact the building until 14 seconds. What are we talking about here? The seismic event picked up the signal prior to the plane impact. How can that be possible? Well, this corroborates the witnesses that you're going to see of explosions even before the plane impact. A lot of people don't know this. And we have a lot more detail on this particular set of research in our webinars, which you can find on YouTube for free. The second plane impact occurs here. The plane impact doesn't occur until 17 seconds later. Here's William Rodriguez, witness.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane.
Prior to the building that got hit by the plane. There's two other witnesses.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds then the first plane hit.
So these witnesses know. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, how and why World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 collapsed. But they stopped, in the case of the Twin Towers, at the initiation of collapse. No analysis whatsoever after the collapse starts. This is what structural engineers do every day for a living. Let's look at the building collapses themselves. The signal starts here, but the building, the main debris, the first debris doesn't even strike the ground till 7 seconds later. How can that be possible? Well, we have explosions again prior to the buildings actually collapsing. That's what you heard those witnesses talking about. Same with the North Tower, where we have the event starting here, and 4 seconds later we have the actual heavy debris hitting the ground. So it doesn't make sense. And so we have Andre Rousseau, author of 50 peer-reviewed papers on applied mechanical geophysics, doing this incredible research here that NIST failed to do and did fraudulently in the case of the analysis of the seismic events. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking, felt like a train. Take a look at the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant it slowing it down to half speed? Is enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition yet again? You ever see those professional demolitions where they set the charges on certain floors and you hear pop, pop, pop? Well, when I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. What's he talking about? Let's take a look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Take a look at these gentlemen. Are they credible?
Floor by floor instead of...
It was if they had detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Well, we're told by NIST that the upper portion of the building here, in the case of the North Tower, drove the rest of the building down and then destroyed itself. This violates the laws of physics, where we have equal and opposite destruction when two bodies collide. Well, that's what's happening here. The upper body, lighter, weaker, is destroying itself in the first 4 seconds. After that, there is no section visible anywhere on any of the photos that you see driving the rest of the building down. It's been destroyed. What happens after that looks more like an eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009, with outward arching streamers and trailed by thick white smoke clouds of these structural steel sections sent out laterally, these ejections in a 1,200-foot diameter. Yes, it's going straight down, but it's going out and down. It's a very explosive event. Take a look at the explosions from underneath. All the way around, like the fireman said, like a belt, all these explosions. Are we looking at a collapse, or are we looking at a series of hundreds of explosions? The debris pile is outside the perimeter of the World Trade Center boundary itself, 1,200 to 1,400 foot. The steel is completely broken up and distributed where? At the pile down below, as you would expect in a gravitational collapse? No, all around World Trade Center. That's where the steel is. Look at the nice, neat pile associated with Building 7. That's an implosion, a classic implosion, versus the very explosive event known as the Twin Towers. That's where all the steel is, outside the perimeter. Number 4, do we have ejections of building materials at the lower floors? These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. 20, 40, 60 stories down below the zone of destruction, we have these ejections, explosive ejections at 150, 100, 200 feet per second, some of them, clocked by physicists with pulverized building solids in these. So these are not puffs of air, as NIST suggests. How fast is the building coming down? Well, let's take a look and time it. 6 seconds. 10 seconds. In a dozen seconds, both of these buildings have been completely shattered, torn to the ground, fallen almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's accelerating. It's not slowing down. It's not decelerating when it meets resistance, which is what the laws of physics tell us should have happened. It should have met 90,000 tons of resistant structural steel, and there's more steel here in the exterior perimeter than there is glass. That's a lot of steel. It should have slowed it down. But what happened to that steel? Oh, it's meeting with the fate of feature number 6, total shattering of the structure down to its individual elements almost, perimeter and structural columns completely dismembered, distributed around, ready, broken up, ready for loading and shipment, just like a controlled demolition is engineered to do. Also resulting in the lateral ejection of structural steel elements. What's causing these freely flying structural steel sections to be ejected laterally at 300 to 600 feet away? What you saw there were 4-ton structural steel sections ejected laterally at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet in every direction, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Structural steel sections are not flammable. Where's the smoke clouds coming from? Think about this. We'll be showing you evidence here of thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Regarding these lateral ejections, Look at the amount of energy that we're talking about here. It's enough energy to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's this energy coming from? Where are the floors? By the way, we have 110 floors, concrete, 4 inches to 8 inches thick in this building, each of them. They're not stacked up on the bottom like in a gravitational collapse. On the right, you see a gravitational collapse, like a pancaking collapse in Mexico. On the left, you see the World Trade Center tower, 2-3-story pile of twisted steel. Where is the 90,000 tons of concrete? What happened to it? As we look at feature number 9, the pulverization of concrete. It's missing at the bottom. Oh, here it is, pulverized in midair. 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a fine powder before it develops its gravitational potential energy and crashes on the ground and breaks up. It's not breaking up down there. What's pulverizing it? High energy explosives are the most likely scenario here, along with thermite. It's pulverizing to 100 micron particles of fine ash that came all the way up here to the West Village, but went from river to river across lower Manhattan in a 3 to 5 inch thick blanket. What did they find, by the way, in all of that powder? We'll be coming to it. What do the experts say? We have 100 structural engineers among the 3,000 signed on to the petition calling for a new investigation. Like William Rice, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 tons or more of supporting structural steel underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. Hello? Wake up, people. Ron Brookman, structural engineer, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the collapse of the towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds? Fire protection engineer, Scott Granger, all 3 collapses were very uniform in nature, but natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Ed Muniak, the fires were weak. NIST reports that they confirm the steel temperatures were low, very low. And World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any other high-rise fire. Feature number 9, persistent heat. Where is this coming from? Well, we have extreme persistent heat in the pile. You can see by the material held in the jaws of the crab claw excavator that it's molten metal. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. This doesn't happen by office fires dripping from the molten steel. Literally molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams. Molten metal, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah. Like lava.
Like lava.
A volcano.
None of this evidence of extreme temperatures, none of this evidence of explosives was included in the NIST report or the earlier FEMA report. Even the structural engineer himself of the World Trade Center, Leslie Robertson, a river of steel flowing, he says. You can see it pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. It's not aluminum, it's not lead from batteries or aluminum from a jet plane, because they don't glow bright yellow in daylight conditions. FEMA documents partially evaporated steel beams. Doesn't happen in 500-degree fires or even 1,000-degree Fahrenheit fires. Does happen at beginning at about 4,000 degrees to partially evaporate steel. And FEMA included this in the metallurgical examination in May of 2002 in their Appendix C, but NIST threw out this report when they took over the investigation in 2002, and we don't see it today. But here it is, documenting never before observed intergranular melting, solid steel girder turning into Swiss cheese like you see there, rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron. That's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Very well documented, but completely ignored by NIST, causing the steel to thin to razor sharpness. What can cause this? rapid oxidation, sulfidation. And we have NIST completely throwing this material out. And even jet fuel doesn't get that hot. It was 600 degrees according to the jet fuel manufacturer. So what can create these temperatures up to 2,500 degrees? The physics says we can tell the temperature by the color of the material, exceeding 2,500 degrees. So let's look and see what could have done that. Could it be thermite? Well, thermite, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
So now we have an answer to the mystery of thermite. We're used, it would explain the sulfur attack on the steel documented by FEMA early on. It would explain the extreme temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees, and it would explain the molten iron, not steel, but molten iron, the byproduct of thermite. NIST did not test for explosives, they say. But others did, many of them, including the U.S. Geological Survey, which finds 10 tons of previously molten iron microspheres in all the World Trade Center dust. 10 tons of it. It was, according to R.J. Lee, formed during the event, not before, not after. Here's how thermite works. It releases thousands of sparks, but they're not sparks, they're molten iron. They form themselves into spheres because of the pressure and the surface tension of an aerosolized liquid. So Niels Harrit and others, a team of 8 scientists, find in all the World Trade Center dust, independently collected samples, nanothermite materials, red on one side, gray on the other. This is extremely important information. So you can find out all the mysteries of why this irrefutable evidence is just so important for the proof of controlled demolition, which is why there's the complete destruction of evidence in the largest crime scene in history, 400 truckloads a day sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it to do a proper investigation. And that's why we want you to learn more, because there's a lot more here than I can bring you in just a half an hour, as you can begin to tell here. That's why we've got to have the truth about 9/11, and we've got to have an investigation. Our petition goes to Congress. We've got draft legislation. It's the Bobby McIlvaine Act. It's inspired by Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son Bobby in explosions. And he knows the truth about 9/11. Most of the family members do. Few of them are standing up and speaking, like today, Matt Campbell from the UK will be here. I'd like to thank everybody for being so patient with me today. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard Gage. I would like to introduce our honored guest. He's a 9/11 victim's family member. He lost his brother, Joff, in World Trade Center 1. And we heard very good news from Matt today over lunch, and that was he was discouraged 2 years ago and almost gave up, but when he learned about the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, he's back.
Thank you, Barbara. Do you want me to just talk now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really prepared anything for this evening. I'm involved with the rally tomorrow. But all I wanted to really say is this journey for truth and justice, it's going to be a long one. It's already 17 years on. But I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of encouragement in terms of results that other family members and campaigners and activists have achieved in Ireland, Northern Ireland, with something called Bloody Sunday, which is back in 1972. Family members didn't actually get together until nearly 20 years after the event. And then after about sort of 6 years of activism, stuff that's been going on for the last, certainly decade with 9/11 Truth, they managed to get, I think it was 98, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair at the time, to effectively promise to reopen and have a new inquiry into the events. I'm not going to go into the details of what went on. You can search it yourself if you're not aware of it. But the point I want to make is nearly 40 years on, the original inquiry was completely quashed, effectively called a cover-up. They obviously achieved their second aim, which was having the new inquiry. And most importantly, apart from exposing all the lies and cover-ups which started almost within hours of the event, but certainly at the highest levels, we're talking Prime Minister, the Lord Chief Justice, which was the highest ranking legal person in the UK, they were involved in the cover-up. And so nearly 40 years on, after a lot of effort, a lot of campaigning and hard graft, they got their result. All the people that were killed, there's 14 of them and 14 injured, were all given their, they were basically said to be innocent. They had been accused of being gunmen and bombers and stuff like that. So the point I want to make is, for me, we're quite young, only 17 years on, and although I hope it's quicker than sort of 40 years, I mean, it's 46 years this year, they're still, well, they're going to find out hopefully in the next month or so whether they're actually going to do prosecutions against the soldiers and other people that covered up and did the killing, obviously, from that day. So it's just to take encouragement from the fact that against all the odds, you can achieve a lot through just determination and just not stopping, getting the message out. Even though there's going to be a change of guard, be it through your politicians, presidents, prime ministers, whatever, you just keep going on. And eventually, hopefully truth and justice will prevail. Thank you.